Well, now we can look at the traits dealing with the reproductive structures, basically flowers and the flower clusters. We'll start at the base of the flower where it attaches to the flower stalk and move upward and in toward the center. And you'll notice that as you do that, you'll see a series of whorls or close spirals of similar parts. So as we move from the base, we have first of all the sepals. These are usually green leafy structures that protect the flower in its bud. Collectively, these sepals are called the calyx. From there, you move up to the petals. So that's the next whorl. These are thin, flat structures, usually fairly colored, and serve to attract pollinators to the flower. Collectively, they are called the corolla. Now we come to the business end of the flower. The next whorl inside the petals are the stamens. Now, you may already be aware that the stamens are comparable to, say, the male structures in, say, animals. This is not technically true because there are not male or female parts in the flower itself. So technically you can't really say it's the male part or the female part. But we can say that in terms of what our purpose here, the stamens basically function in the same way male structures would. So stamens produce pollen. Pollen is formed in 4 pollen sacs that are fused together to form the anther at the top of the stamen. The top part that's swollen with the pollen is the anther, and the stalk is called the filament. Filaments are usually filamentous, in other words, thread-like. And then in the center of the flower, attached to the what we would call the floral axis, basically the extension of the stalk up into the flower, are what we might consider to be female structures. Again, technically not female, but serving as female structures because they contain the ovules, which are going to be developing into seeds, obviously in the reproduction of the plant. So this structure, which is serving as the female function, is called the pistil. The base of the pistil is swollen and expanded and contains one or more ovules. Therefore, the basal swollen part is called the ovary. From the ovary, on its top extends a stalk-like structure called the style, and the style holds on top of it a slightly swollen, sticky structure called the stigma. The stigma is held at the right position to collect pollen as the pollinator or the wind brings the pollen to the flower. What I've shown you here in terms of the flower parts is one sort of flower that you may see as we're going around, with lots of parts visible. Let's look at a different plant and still look for these same parts. So we'll look for the calyx, the corolla, and here you see the petals are fused together with just the tips separate, it's splayed apart. There you see a filament and anther of a stamen, the ovary, down below other parts, a style, and stigma. So you can have very different looking flowers, but all the parts are still there. Next we come to the concept of the flower construction. And this is really sort of taking the idea of you've got the flower parts in whorls that are in set positions: sepals, petals, stamens, pistils, in that order toward the center. But within those whorls, in between the whorls, you can have some things going on that make flowers different. So let's look at what those things are. First of all, all the parts can be completely separate from one another. And in this case, we say the parts are free. I might mention at this point, that because the seeds that are developing are in the ovary, as the ovary develops, it develops into the fruit. So we have in this picture a flower with the young pistils, and then inset with that shows the developing fruits. They're not mature yet, but they are developing. So parts free. Now you can have parts within a whorl, that is the like parts, fused to one another. So like parts fused. In this case, we have the sepals are fused together in their lower thirds. Having sepal fused is a very common situation in flowers. You can have petals fused to petals. In this case, about 2/3 of the petal lengths are fused. And the free parts of the petals then are what we call the lobes of the corolla. Having petals fused to petals is also a very common situation in flowers. You can have stamens fused to stamens. Now this actually is a fairly uncommon situation, but if you do, then they tend to form a tube or maybe even a column with the separate anthers at the top. We will see this in a very large family, the daisy and sunflower family. Pistils can be fused to pistils. Again, this is a very common situation. In this case, the ovaries will be fused to make a single ovary. When you have the ovaries fused, there will be 2 or more sections to the ovary, and generally they will be 2 or more chambers, but sometimes the chambers are all run together into a single chamber, but it still has those 2 or more sections. You may have one style or several styles and one stigma or several stigmas, and if it's one stigma, it generally has lobes that indicates the number of sections or number of pistils that have been fused together. So there you have like parts fused to like parts. You can also have adjacent parts fused. So parts in one whorl fused to the structures in the adjacent whorl. So in this case we see petals fused to stamens. And generally the lower parts of the stamens will be fused to the lower part of the petals. This is a very common situation in flowers. Also in the next picture here you see the bases of the stamens, petals, and sepals all fused together. And when they do that, that forms what we call a floral cup or a floral tube that basically surrounds the base of the flower. This situation is fairly common. We'll see it in a number of cases as we look at the flowers in the course. You can have the floral tube fused to the ovary, or the floral cup fused to the ovary. So this makes the stamens, petals, and sepals look like they're coming off the top of the ovary. Now we'll talk about that in just a moment as we talk about ovary position. But having the floral cup or floral tube fused to the ovary, again, is a fairly common situation in flowers. And finally, you can have stamens fused to pistils. This is actually quite rare, found mostly in just orchids. So now that brings us then to ovary position, as I just mentioned. Now, as we see in this picture, we have the stamens, petals, and sepals all coming from the floral axis, or the top of the flower stalk, below the ovaries. So in this case, we say the ovaries are, or the ovary is, superior. Even if you have a floral cup, if the floral cup is not fused to the ovary, it basically is that's all going to be below the ovary or ovaries, and you still have a superior ovary or superior ovaries. In the next picture, we see a flower in which the floral tube is fused to the ovary. And when you look at it, you say, oh, well, the petals, the sepals, and the stamens are all attached on top of the ovary. In this case, we say that the ovary is inferior. So this is a case where you have the floral tube or floral cup fused to the ovary all the way to the top, so that the other parts appear to come off the top of the ovary.